Is India on the verge of being split apart by multiple separatist movements? No, I don't see that happening. But India does have a lot of separatist movements, as much as 150 according to some counts. None of these groups are anywhere near having any sort of success, but learning who and where these groups are is a great way to learn more about this amazingly diverse country. So let's have a look. Roll the music. Hi everybody, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and before we go any further, let me explain a few things. First of all, this is the second video in a series I've done about secessionist movements by country. The first video was about secessionist movements in my home country, the United States, so check it out. Secondly, several of the movements I'm going to describe here have at some point in their history engaged in violence, or have some association with violent actions. This video is not an endorsement of any of these groups and is definitely not an endorsement of political change through violent action. I'm going to try and focus on the ideas which these groups espouse, but I don't in any way want to minimize the turmoil and destruction caused by armed insurgents anywhere in the world. I've also decided not to cover India's Naxalite Maoist insurgency. These terrorists sometimes control parts of the country known as the Red Corridor. But this isn't strictly speaking an independence movement. The Naxalites want to set up a communist regime all across India, not create their own new country. And lastly, this video is going to stick to attempts to create new countries, not to redraw the internal state boundaries within India. Now, state boundaries do come up in a couple places, but that's not really the main focus of the video. I may do a video about that at some date in the future. So let's get started. Number 1, Kashmir. Kashmir is mostly known as the setting for one of the world's most intractable geopolitical stalemates, a struggle for territory fought between Pakistan and India for over 70 years. But since the start of the conflict, many Kashmiris have supported a third option which gets a lot less attention: independence. At the time of India's independence from Britain in 1947, India contained hundreds of princely states which were ruled by princes, and these enjoyed special privileges and autonomy during the colonial era. Most of these were tiny, but a very few were large, and one of these was the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which sat right in the spot where the newly independent Pakistan and India both wanted territory. And by the way, just to explain, Jammu is the part of Jammu and Kashmir which sits in the very south of the former princely state and traditionally has a majority Hindu population. But overall, Jammu and Kashmir is predominantly Muslim. However, despite being majority Muslim, Jammu and Kashmir had long been ruled by a Hindu prince. And the current prince at the time of India's independence was Maharaja Hari Singh. At the end of the colonial era, the Maharaja had a three-way choice. He could opt for Jammu and Kashmir to join majority Hindu India, majority Muslim Pakistan, or there was a third option. He could choose for Jammu and Kashmir to become independent. So the Maharaja dithered at first, then decided that he wanted independence, and then under great pressure changed his mind and decided that he wanted Jammu and Kashmir to join India. This indecision, which was over a really big topic, created a lot of tension, and that boiled over in October 1947 into a full-scale war between India and Pakistan, just a few months after both countries had become independent. This first war over Kashmir was not decisive for either side, and today there's currently no official border dividing Kashmir. What passes for a border is actually called the line of control. But in addition to the two large governments squaring off over Kashmir, there are dozens of political and paramilitary groups taking part in the conflict as well. There are so many I can't possibly begin to provide a meaningful survey of all of them, so instead I'm going to concentrate on just one: the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, or JKLF. The JKLF has evolved several times since its founding in the 1970s, and it has its roots in organizations which began in the 1960s. And for decades it was a militant group which received arms and training from the Pakistani army. But the JKLF has always fought for the independence of Kashmir and considers both India and Pakistan to be occupying forces. It wants to remove both the Pakistani and Indian armies from Jammu and Kashmir, so that alliance between the JKLF and Pakistan was never a particularly good fit. In 1994, the JKLF split, and the part of the organization based in Indian-administered Kashmir, led by its chairman, Yasin Malik, renounced violence and disbanded its military wing. As a sign of the organization's new peaceful intentions, Malik called for the repatriation of 400,000 Kashmiri Pandits. This is a group of people who are traditionally Hindu and who had traditionally lived in Jammu and Kashmir but had been driven out over the years because of the endless fighting. According to its website, the JKLF is the largest and most populous organization in all sides of divided Jammu Kashmir. Substantiating that claim is difficult because the JKLF has been banned from taking part in elections in either Pakistan or Indian-administered Kashmir for decades. And in 2019, the JKLF was classified officially as a terrorist organization by the Indian government. The ban took place in the wake of an attack, which was officially blamed on another organization. So, other than the fact that the JKLF supports secession, which is illegal technically in India, I don't really know why else it would be banned at the moment. There can be no doubt that the JKLF was once a violent organization in its past. And there may very well continue to be organizations which are violent, which have the same name or similar names. But there does appear at least to be a decently well-organized, peaceful group led by Yasin Malik. Although Malik is currently in an Indian prison, awaiting trial for an attack he is accused of taking part in before his renunciation of violence. Will the JKLF, through non-violent and diplomatic action, succeed in creating an independent Jammu and Kashmir? As long as there are two nuclear powers squaring off over the territory, that seems unlikely. And the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir was recently downgraded to a union territory by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. As a union territory, the Indian federal government appoints the political leadership in Jammu and Kashmir now, and it also controls all legislation regarding to security and policing. So Kashmir's independence movement at the moment is facing a very uphill task. Number 2, Northeast India. The part of India which appears to have the largest number of separatist groups by far is Northeast India. And by that, I specifically mean these 7 states: Assam, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, Manipur, Tripura, and Nagaland, known collectively as the Seven Sisters. There is not one independence movement for Northeast India. There are dozens of groups, often with overlapping territorial claims and ambitions. And their goals range from creating a new state from within India to outright independence. Every one of the groups I'm about to mention, as far as I know, engages in violent action, so once again, this is very much not an endorsement. So each of the separatist movements in Northeast India is unique, but overall I think there are some common causes for much of the unrest. First of all, Northeast India is geographically and politically isolated, and I mean really isolated. The borders with both China and Burma are officially closed. With the right paperwork, it's possible to cross the border from Bangladesh, something I've actually had the chance to do myself, but Bangladesh is a country with a lot of economic and social problems of its own. Traveling overland to the rest of India is pretty difficult. Only 3 of the 7 states are connected to India's vast system of railways, and even then the trip from Guwahati in Assam to Kolkata, the nearest major city, takes almost an entire day. So as I mentioned, I crossed the border from Bangladesh into Northeast India, specifically Meghalaya, in the late 1990s. Meghalaya is an absolutely wonderful, magical place. I think I spent about 2 weeks there. I had an absolutely brilliant time. But if I'm honest, it really didn't feel like the rest of India. I saw a lot more Protestant churches than I did Hindu temples or mosques. And when I bought my morning newspaper every morning, it was a day old. National newspapers like the Times of India or the Hindustan Times just took too long to arrive for them to be sold on the same day of publication. Since then, privatized airlines have made it a lot easier to travel to Northeast India if you have the money, and I don't doubt that the internet and mobile phones will have made it a lot easier for people to get up-to-date news. But still, this is a culturally different and very remote part of the country. Each of the 7 sister states has at least one insurgent separatist movement. Assam and Manipur seem to have dozens of them. Listing them all would be pretty exhausting, so I'll just mention some of the more notable ones. Manipur had a centuries-long history as an independent kingdom and did not formally join the British Empire until 1891. There are several well-organized independence movements, including the People's Liberation Army of Manipur, the People's Revolutionary Party of Kangleipak, Kangleapak refers to an earlier name for Manipur, and the Kangleapak Communist Party. In Nagaland, the most prominent independence movement is the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, which is working to unite the Naga people in both India and Burma in a proposed new state to be called Nagalim. Despite being a socialist organization, the NSCN's official slogan is Nagaland for Christ, because this may surprise you, but Nagaland is 95% Christian. The United Liberation Front of Assam is arguably the most well-known group fighting for independence in Assam. A main source of tension in the state, and to be honest this is a problem all across Northeast Asia, is the perception that Indians from other parts of the country are migrating to Northeast India, taking jobs and displacing local people. That's just a tiny sample of the many groups fighting for independence or autonomy in Northeast India. I should note that several of these groups have formed an alliance of sort called the WEC Forum. WEC standing for Western Southeast Asia, which is their preferred name for Northeast India. I'm not sure this organization is currently active, and to be honest, from my research, I kind of get the feeling that none of these groups are particularly on the upswing at the moment. Perhaps with advancements in technology and infrastructure, Northeast India just doesn't seem as isolated as it once did. Number 3, Dravida Nadu. You may know that at independence, colonial India was divided into an independent Pakistan and an independent India. But what you may not know is that there were actually other ideas for how the country might be divided. And there was one plan for much of southern India to be carved off in a newly independent country to be called Dravida Nadu. And by the way, Dravida refers to the people who speak Dravidian languages, like Telugu, Tamil, and Kannada, while Nadu just means place or land. The initial movement for establishing Dravida Nadu began in earnest in the 1920s, when the Justice Party came to power in the colonial region known as the Madras Presidency. From the start, the movement was not just about independence for southern India. It was also an anti-Brahmin movement, the Brahmins being the highest caste in the Indian caste system. The Justice Party argued that Brahmins did not originally come from southern India, that they had moved into that part of India from the north, and that the culture of southern India was much more naturally egalitarian. That's what the claim was anyway. But the Dravida Nadu independence movement seems to have been most popular amongst Tamil speakers, partly because non-Tamil speakers were just worried that they would be overwhelmed by Tamils in an independent Dravida Nadu. But the movement was still sufficiently popular to remain prominent for decades. And in 1940, 7 years before India became officially independent, a secessionist conference was held in Kanchipuram, and a committee was formed to officially pursue secession and independence for Dravida Nadu. In 1944, Erode Venkatappa Ramasi, also known simply as Periyar, reformed the Justice Party as the Dravidar Kazhagam, or the Dravidian Party. A few years later, in 1949, C.N. Annadurai formed a more radical splinter group known as the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, or the Dravidian Progressive Party. Momentum for this movement pretty much stalled after India gained its independence. In 1948, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, created a commission to investigate redrawing India's internal boundaries. The plan was enacted in 1956, more or less creating the state divisions that we have today. While not perfect, India's 1956 boundaries were intended to reflect linguistic divisions, and this resulted in a Tamil-speaking state known today as Tamil Nadu. And with the creation of Tamil Nadu, the push for an independent Dravida Nadu lost most of its momentum. But not all of its momentum. The Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam still exists today, and is in fact currently the ruling party in Tamil Nadu. The second biggest party in Tamil Nadu is actually one of its offshoots, the All India Anna Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam. So even though its goal of an independent Dravida Nadu has not succeeded, the political legacy of the Justice Party and the Dravida Kazhagam lives on. Number 4, Sikkim. Remember how I mentioned that at independence, India contained hundreds of princely states and that, in theory, these princely states had the option to opt for independence? Well, one of these states, Sikkim, a very small Himalayan kingdom sandwiched between Bhutan and Nepal, actually did this, but not without controversy. Since 1642, Sikkim has been an absolute monarchy, ruled by a monarch called the Chogyal. But there was a significant desire amongst many Sikkimese to join India, where they were hoping that they would enjoy a more democratic form of government. But the Chogyal chose independence, even though Sikkim, with China to its north and India to its south, was in a pretty vulnerable spot. Both countries sought to control Sikkim, and eventually in 1950, after much effort by Prime Minister Nehru, Sikkim officially became an Indian protectorate. This meant that while Sikkim was still technically independent, India controlled its foreign relations and defense. In 1953, Chogyal Tashi Namgyal made some small concessions to democracy in the form of a state council and constitutional government. And shortly after this, an event of international significance took place in Sikkim. In 1956, the Dalai Lama, the spiritual and temporal ruler of Tibet, escaped from Chinese-occupied territory into India via Sikkim. A new Chogyal was crowned in 1963, but appetite for democratic rule remained strong, and pro-Indian sentiment began to bubble to the top again. In 1973, there were anti-royalist riots, and the Prime Minister of Sikkim asked for the Indian military to come in and take charge, which they did. A referendum was held, and 97.5% of the Sikkimese people voted to abolish the monarchy. A few weeks later, Sikkim was admitted as India's 22nd state. Now, if I'm honest, there isn't any real serious independence movement in Sikkim at the moment, but there almost was one once, and there are actually a few issues about Sikkim's status that I find really interesting. The last officially reigning Chogyal died in 1982, but his son, Wangchuck Namgyal, appeared in the formal royal palace shortly afterwards. He held a coronation service and was received as the new king by many Sikkimese. He was interviewed by a reporter from India Today while in the palace, while his subjects, including members of Sikkim's legislature, came and laid scarves at his feet to demonstrate their loyalty. When asked, "Do you want independence for Sikkim?" the new Chogyal answered cryptically, "If that's what the people want." He also denied that the Indian Army's arrival into the country in 1975 was something that the Sikkimese people wanted, and asserted that the 97.5% referendum result was fake. Reading that interview, it reads like the new Chogyal thought that he might be able to spark some sort of people's revolution and lead Sikkim to reclaim its independent status. But this was not to be. According to a Hindustan Times article published a few years ago, Wangchuck Namgyal began living a reclusive life not long after his coronation, and he's now a monk and spends much of his time meditating in caves in Bhutan and Nepal. Other than the Chogyal and his supporters, there was one other group which was really not keen on Sikkim's independence: the Chinese government. For decades, China refused to recognize Sikkim's status as an Indian state. The government continued to print maps which showed Sikkim as an independent country, and China kept its border with Sikkim closed, which hurt the local economy. This was partly down to the natural rivalry between India and China, but I think China saw Indian control of Sikkim as a geopolitical threat. In 2000, this policy led to some serious embarrassment for the Chinese government, however. The Karmapa, a lama who is reincarnated similarly to the Dalai Lama, escaped from Chinese-controlled Tibet into Sikkim. His Buddhist order, the Karma Kagyu, is traditionally based in Tibet, but it has a headquarters in exile based in a monastery in Sikkim, which the Karmapa escaped to. China wanted to lodge an official protest, but who could they protest to? There was no independent Sikkimese government that they could speak to, and if they spoke to the Indian authorities, they would be, by default, recognizing India's control over Sikkim. So after looking silly for a while, in 2003, China decided to officially recognize Sikkim as part of India, and finally opened its border as a result. One last thing. Sikkim is one of the few Indian states where foreigners are not allowed to visit without a special permit. Now, those permits are not particularly difficult to get. I got one. It just felt really weird. It felt like I was going into an office and getting a visa to visit Sikkim, even though it wasn't an independent country. And I got this form. It got stamped in and out as I entered and left Sikkim, and it allowed me to stay for 2 weeks. I think I stayed 4 or 5 days. Absolutely wonderful place. Highly recommend it. If you get the chance to go to Sikkim, go. Number 5, Khalistan. Okay, this is admittedly probably the most controversial and the most dangerous of the separatist movements in India. The proposed independent country of Khalistan would be home to the Sikhs, adherents to a religion known as Sikhism. which was founded in a part of India known as Punjab in the late 15th century. And by the way, I'm saying Sikh and Sikhism on purpose. That is the way that it's actually pronounced in Punjabi and the way lots of Sikhs prefer it to be pronounced. There are 25 million Sikhs worldwide today, and observant Sikhs, the men at least, can easily be identified by their uncut hair, which is traditionally covered by a turban. The term Khalistan means the land of the Khalsa, and the Khalsa in Sikhism is the group of observant Sikhs. Today, Sikhs live all over the world, but remain heavily concentrated in Punjab, specifically the part of Punjab which became part of India during the partition. The modern Pakistani state of Punjab, which once had a very significant Sikh minority, contains almost no Sikhs today at all. But long before India's independence or partition of Punjab, there was a movement for a free and independent Khalistan. This movement rumbled along for decades but turned decidedly militant in the mid-1980s. In June 1984, the Indian Army attacked the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest site in the Sikh religion, which was then occupied by a heavily armored pro-Khalistan militia group. 4 months later, the Indian President Indira Gandhi was assassinated in retaliation by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards, and this in turn led to anti-Sikh riots across the country. The militant attacks continued for the next 10 years or so, including an attempt to assassinate the Chief Minister of Punjab, who was on a visit to Canada. By the mid-1990s, the Khalistan movement was in serious decline. This was partly because of heavy-handed tactics by the Indian government, but also there were problems within the movements themselves. There was the normal sort of infighting and rivalry that you might expect between groups, but there wasn't a very clear definition of what Khalistan was exactly going to be, or what its borders would be. Would it be just Indian Punjab? Would it spill over into other parts of India? Would it include Pakistani Punjab? And also, some of the independence movements began attracting a criminal element, and the whole thing got pretty murky and unappealing. But, murky and unappealing though it is, the Khalistan independence movement does seem to be enjoying a sort of resurgence at the moment. Not so much in India itself, more amongst the Sikh community worldwide. I was pretty shocked to see this during my research, but there was actually a global referendum on the establishment of Khalistan held very recently, starting in October 2021 in London. Organized by a US-based group called Sikhs for Justice, 30,000 Sikhs reportedly took part in the voting in London, with additional votes taking place in other locations over time. Here's a picture of Sikhs in Geneva taking part in a vote in December during a snowstorm. I'm not sure if this voting is finished or not. Presumably the results will show a very strong level of support for Khalistan amongst the people that voted. I mean, you're not going to show up in a snowstorm to vote against a proposition in a non-binding referendum, are you? Khalistan activists do more than just organize unofficial referendums, however. During Justin Trudeau's infamous visit to India in 2018, yes, the one where he dressed like that, an event was organized in Mumbai by a Canadian MP of Indian heritage, Randeep Sarai. Sarai, a Sikh, invited a fellow Canadian Sikh to the event named Jaspal Atwal. When Atwal's name was discovered on the guest list, Indian government officials were outraged. Atwal was one of the men convicted of attempting to murder the Punjabi chief minister during his visit to Vancouver in 1986. Embarrassed, Trudeau did his best to distance himself from the pro-Khalistan terrorist. Okay, that does it. There are a lot more groups which I could cover, but to be honest, these are the ones which I think are the most interesting or prominent. Is India on the verge of splitting up? No. My impression from my research is actually that most of these independence movements are in a state of decline at the moment, and that's probably for the best. However, the Indian government is on occasion extremely heavy-handed in its treatments of separatist organizations, and I don't personally approve of being oppressive towards your own citizens, even if that oppression is in pursuit of a goal like peace and stability. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if there's a group that you think I should have covered but I didn't. Also, let me know if any of these groups surprised you. And I'll see you guys in the next video.